My name is Oliver, and what I'm going to tell you here is not my story, but that of my father, James. He's 94 now, and all his life he's always been a skeptical, practical man, incapable of believing anything he couldn't touch or measure. A British engineer in 1972, he was transferred to Brazil to work on an infrastructure project. As she spoke Portuguese fluently, my grandmother was Brazilian. Her adaptation was quick. The company rented him an apartment in the Salazar building, a simple building in Liberdade, a historic neighborhood of São Paulo. At first it seemed like a quiet, normal place. But as the weeks passed, he realized that the apartment was anything but normal. The first few days were quiet. My father was busy with work and used his free time to explore the city. The building had friendly residents, the neighborhood was bustling, and overall it seemed like an ordinary place. But in the third week something began to bother him. Every night he heard a cry coming from the apartment above his, number 707. It was a childish, muffled cry, as if the child was alone and trying not to attract attention. At first, he ignored it, thinking it was just a careless family. But when the laments continued for days, he decided to talk to the janitor. The man's reaction left him surprised. His face has faded, and he replied in a whisper, "This apartment has been empty since the accident. The accident happened in 1968. A girl named Lucia, only 8 years old, was found dead in the bathtub of the 707. Neighbors said that the mother found her already lifeless in the bathtub. They never found out how it happened. It was such a shock that her parents left the apartment shortly after the burial and never returned. Since then, the apartment has been closed. My father didn't believe in ghosts. He was a man of science, accustomed to solving problems with logic and facts. Still, that night he couldn't sleep properly. The girl's cry returned softly, crossing the ceiling as if her pain impregnated the concrete. He forced himself to ignore it, covering his head with his pillow. But one thing began to bother him. The sound didn't seem to come from a single point. At times it seemed to be right above him, as if the child was lying on the floor of the empty apartment. Other times it seemed more distant, almost as if the lament echoed through the building itself. Days later, when he got home from work, he got into the elevator and noticed something strange. As soon as the door closed, all the buttons lit up at the same time. He hadn't squeezed anything. He felt a shiver, but he still tried to convince himself that it was a defect. That's when he noticed a presence in the corner of the elevator. He turned slowly, and there she was, a girl in a blue dress, dark and wet hair. She stared at him. He didn't say anything. He just smiled, a wide and empty smile, and the elevator started to go up. It didn't stop on my floor, but stopped on all the other floors. When the door opened on the top floor, it was no longer there. That night he drank a glass of whiskey before going to sleep, trying to ward off the tension. He convinced himself that he had imagined everything. But then, at 2 in the morning, the crying returned. This time it didn't come from the ceiling, it was coming from the hallway. He got up, went to the door, and peeked through the peephole. There was nothing, just a dimly lit hallway and the sound of the city in the background. He hesitated for a moment, and on an impulse opened the door. The sound stopped. The hallway was empty. From then on, things started to get worse. One night when he returned from work, he found the light in the hallway flashing. The building was old, and he tried to ignore it. But then he heard a noise, a soft sob. At the end of the hallway, huddled near the emergency stairs, was Lucia. His face was buried in his knees, his shoulders trembling in small spasms. He tried to speak, but the instant the lamp flashed again, it disappeared. At the same moment, all the doors of the stairs of all the floors slammed at once, as if someone had slammed them shut. My father realized that he was not the only one to notice strange things. A lady on the 4th floor said she saw shadows moving across the terrace at night. One couple reported hearing footsteps in apartment 707, as if someone was pacing back and forth. But the worst came from a young man named Miguel, who lived on the floor above 707. He said he sometimes woke up at dawn to a strange sound, as if someone was struggling in the water. Things got even stranger when my father started noticing another visitor. A man in a black suit, tall, thin, old-fashioned looking, like someone out of an old photo. At first, he thought he was just a resident of the building, but then he realized something. He never spoke to anyone. He only appeared at the end of the elevator or standing at the end of the corridor, watching. One day, he tried to talk to the janitor about it. "A man in a black suit," the janitor repeated, frowning. "There is no one like that here." One morning, my father woke up to a peculiar sound, that of water pouring, as if someone had forgotten the tap open. He got up, still sleepy, and followed the sound to the bathroom. The bathtub was empty, but the walls were covered with water droplets. The mirror was fogged up, and he had a strange sensation, as if he were not alone in the room. After that night, my father decided that he could no longer ignore what was happening. But what could he do? He didn't believe in ghosts. He didn't have anyone to talk to about it without sounding crazy. And each night the events seemed to get more intense. He started to sleep with the bathroom door closed, but that didn't stop the sound of the water from returning. Now, whenever he woke up in the middle of the night, he smelled a damp smell in the air, as if the apartment had been hit by a fine rain that only he could perceive. A week later, when he got home from work, he took the elevator as usual. As soon as the doors closed, he felt a sudden chill, as if the temperature had dropped several degrees suddenly. The light flashed once, then another, and then the elevator stopped between two floors. He felt his stomach sink. On the dashboard, the floor, numbers flashed randomly, as if something was interfering with the system. That's when he felt it. A faint breath right behind him, slow. When he turned his face, he saw a reflection in the elevator mirror. It was the girl with wet hair, a pale face and sunken eyes, smiling at him. He turned around so fast that he almost fell. But the elevator was empty. No girls, nothing. The heart hammered in his chest. A second later, the elevator jerked and went back up. When the doors opened on his floor, he hurried out, without looking back. But as he walked down the corridor, he felt a shiver on the back of his neck. That uncomfortable feeling that he was being watched. Something made him look at the emergency stairs. There, standing in the half-darkness, was the silhouette of the man in black. He didn't move. She just stared at him, as if she was expecting something. My father tried to convince himself that it was all just paranoia. But then that night, something happened that he couldn't explain. Around 3 in the morning, he woke up to a noise inside the apartment, an insistent drip. His heart raced. He stood up slowly, feeling a weight on his shoulders. He walked to the bathroom. He turned the handle, the door opened without resistance, and there was the bathtub, filled to the brim, the water dark and still. But what made him retreat was not that. That's what he saw in the reflection of the mirror. Behind him, little Lucia, with her wet hair stuck to her face, watched him. He turned in a reflection, but the bathroom was empty. The mirror, however, was no longer fogged up. Now there was something scribbled on it in thin, elongated scribbles, as if they had been traced by small fingers. My father left there almost stumbling, his body seized by an instinctive dread. He locked himself in his room and spent the rest of the night awake, listening to the noises of the city, mixed with the uncomfortable silence of the apartment. He wanted to get out of there. I needed to get out of there. But something inside him said that if he tried to leave before the right time, he might not be able to. The next morning, my father decided that he would no longer stay in the apartment alone. At work, he casually mentioned to a colleague that the building seemed to have a strange atmosphere. The man, a Brazilian named Carlos, laughed, but his laughter soon died when my father mentioned the address of the building. "Have you heard of that?" asked Carlos, now serious. "Everyone knows that there is something wrong in that place. My uncle worked in the maintenance of the building years ago. He talked about noises on the 707, about the girl who died there. But he also spoke of something worse, something that was already there before." My father felt a shiver. "Anything worse?" he repeated, trying not to sound impressed. Carlos looked around as if he didn't want to be heard, and then whispered, "He said the girl wasn't the problem. It was the man in black." My father froze. Carlos continued, "Nobody knows who or what he is, but they say that those who see him often, it's never the same again." My father tried to laugh, but his voice sounded weak. He didn't want to show the terror that was growing inside him. That night, he didn't want to go home. He went to a bar and stayed there late, drinking more than he should. But at some point, he had to face reality. He had nowhere to go. So, he took courage and returned. He went up the elevator, avoiding looking at the mirrors. When she stepped out into the hallway, the silence was almost absolute. He walked to the door of the apartment, unlocked it, and entered. It was only when he locked the door behind him that he noticed something strange. The apartment was cold, much more than it should be. The first thing he did was check the bathroom. The door was ajar. He reached out and, trembling, pushed slowly. The mirror looked normal. The bathtub empty, no noise. He let out a sigh of relief and turned to leave. That's when he heard it. A muffled, almost imperceptible sound. One breath, and it came under the bed. Panic rose instantly. He didn't want to look, but a part of him knew that if he didn't look, it would stay there, waiting. Slowly, he lowered himself. The room was dark, but his eyes adjusted enough to see under the bed. At first, he only saw shadows, but then 2 small hands emerged from the darkness, dragging along the ground towards him. Small and pale with bluish nails, the blood ran cold. He threw himself backwards, jumping away, but when he blinked, his hands were gone. The room was in complete silence, as if nothing had happened, but he knew something was there. He didn't sleep that night. He sat on the bed, his eyes fixed on the bathroom door, waiting for any movement, any sound. The silence was so deep that he could hear his own accelerated breathing. A few hours later, the entire apartment seemed to shake for an instant, as if an invisible weight pressed against the walls. The air became heavy, difficult to breathe. Then something fell to the floor of the hallway, a dull thud. He stood up hesitantly and opened the door to his room. The hallway was dark except for a dim light coming from the kitchen. He moved forward slowly, each footstep echoing across the wooden floor. When he arrived at the room, he saw what had fallen, a picture frame. It was a photo of our family taken years before the glass was cracked. He didn't touch the frame. He just retreated, trying to control the terror that was growing inside him. It was then that he heard the sound. Dripping water, but it didn't come from the kitchen, nor from the bathroom. It came from above, from the ceiling. He looked up and his heart almost stopped. Dark spots were forming there, as if something was leaking from the upstairs. But it wasn't just water. It was something thicker, something that oozed slowly, creating twisted patterns on the ceiling. And then, among the abstract drawings, he saw it. Small empty circles, aligned like 2 eyes staring at him. The survival instinct screamed inside him. He grabbed the key to the apartment and got out of there as fast as he could. He ran to the elevator, pressed the button repeatedly. The doors opened, and he entered without thinking. But before the doors closed, something made her stomach turn. A reflection in the elevator mirror. There she was, Lucia, standing in the corner, her blue dress clinging to her wet body. But there was something different this time. She wasn't just laughing. She whispered something, and for a moment he was sure he heard his own name. He closed his eyes, holding his breath. He felt the elevator move, the floors passing too slowly. When she opened her eyes again, Lucia was gone, but something remained. A wet handprint in the mirror right where she was. The elevator stopped on the ground floor. He ran away, crossing the lobby without looking back. The doorman on duty, an elderly and slight man, looked up and frowned. "You saw him, didn't you?" My father stopped, his heart racing. "The man in black," the doorman added. He did not answer. He just went out into the street and walked aimlessly. The day was already beginning to dawn. The cold wind helped to ward off the suffocating feeling of the apartment. When she finally plucked up the courage to return, the building looked the same as always. But upon entering the apartment, something was wrong. The air was different, heavier. It was only when he closed the door that he noticed. All the kitchen chairs were turned upside down, stacked on the table. He tried to convince himself that someone had entered there, but there were no signs of a break-in. Something or someone wanted him to know that he was not alone there. He decided not to touch the chairs. He took a blanket and went to sleep on the couch with all the lights on. But sleep did not come. With each passing minute, I felt as if I was being watched. The sensation was so intense that at one point he turned around suddenly, expecting to see something behind him. But there was nothing, at least nothing he could see. The next night she decided to lock the bedroom door and put a piece of furniture in front of it. He was physically and mentally exhausted, lay down in bed, and despite his fears soon fell asleep. In the middle of the night he woke up suddenly. Someone was whispering, low sounds, almost like a song. His blood ran cold. It wasn't coming from the hallway, nor from the room. It was coming under the bed. He held his breath, trying to convince himself that it was nothing. But the sound continued, a thin, trembling melody, like a child humming alone in the dark. Something inside him screamed at him not to look, but another part knew that if they didn't look now, they would never sleep there again. With his heart racing, he lowered himself slowly. Nothing. The space under the bed was empty, but the sound was still there. He quickly stood up and took his keys. I wouldn't stay there for another minute. When he opened the door to his room, the singing ceased instantly. The entire apartment was plunged into absolute silence. But before leaving, he realized something. The wet handprints. In the mirror, on the bathroom door, on the wall near the bed. From that night on, he made a decision. He would no longer sleep in that apartment. He packed a backpack with the essentials and started spending the early hours in hotels near work. During the day, he returned to the building only to leave and pick up clothes and some work material. But each time I entered the apartment, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. And worse, the wet handprints never completely disappeared. Even after cleaning, they came back, always in the same places. In the 5th month, he met a lady on the 3rd floor who, according to neighbors, had certain gifts. She was short, thin, and always walked around with a colorful scarf tied around her head. When he asked about apartment 707, she was silent for a long time, her eyes lost somewhere beyond it. So I just said, "The girl is not alone." He felt a shiver down his spine. Before she could ask anything else, the lady got into the elevator and disappeared through the floors. The next day, he learned that the same lady had been found unconscious inside the elevator. She mumbled nonsense, her eyes open but empty, as if they were looking at something no one else saw. They called an ambulance and took her to the hospital. My father never saw her again after that. But that night, for the first time, he dreamed of Lucia. In the dream, she was in the bathtub of apartment 707, the water rising slowly as she stared directly at him, her eyes empty, expressionless. Events began to intensify. On the eve of his departure, he returned to the apartment to pick up his last things. The place looked different, colder. As she packed her suitcase, she heard footsteps in the hallway. Slow, shuffling steps. He held his breath, his heart pounding in his chest. When he turned to the door, he saw it. The man in black. He was standing there, motionless, at the end of the hallway. The ceiling light flickered, casting strange shadows over his figure. But this time, something was different. My father felt a dread he had never felt before, because now he could see the man's face, or rather, the lack of it. In place of eyes, only deep, dark holes. In place of the mouth, an absolute emptiness. My father couldn't move, I couldn't breathe. The only thing he could do was close his eyes in terror, and when he opened his eyes again, the hallway was empty. He left there at the same moment without looking back. He went straight to a hotel and the next day took the first flight back to England. He never returned to Brazil. He never mentioned the Salazar building again. For years, he told only parts of this story, as if he avoided remembering everything at once. He said that time made memories lose strength. But last year, when I found his diary in the basement, I realized that he never forgot. The diary was a simple notebook with pages yellowed by time. The notes began normally, describing the first days in Brazil, the adaptation to work. But as I turned the pages, his writing became more frantic, more desperate. He talked about the sleepless nights, about the wet handprints, about the man in black who appeared closer and closer. In one excerpt, he wrote something that made me feel a chill down my spine. He's watching me. But it still hasn't come close enough. As the pages progressed, he talked less about Lucia and more about the man in black. as if it had just been a warning, as if something worse was lurking. The last month in the diary was a blur of incoherent. Totes. On one page, my father wrote only 3 words, repeated several times, "He's here." And on the next page, the handwriting was so shaky that I could barely decipher it. But one phrase stood out in the midst of the chaos. "I should never have stayed." And then I got to the last page. There was only a single sentence written in the center of the page, in small, firm letters, as if my father had regained control. At the last moment, when everything is silent, I hear the bathtub in my room filling up on its own. I closed the diary with trembling hands. I looked around the basement, feeling a strange restlessness rise inside me. Since that day, something has changed. I don't know how to explain it. Maybe it's just paranoia. Perhaps you have read too much about something that should have remained forgotten. But sometimes late at night, when I'm home alone and everything is in absolute silence, I keep imagining. Everything my father went through there, for sure I wouldn't have stayed there even half the time. And for a moment, I swear I can smell something moist in the air. But I refuse to look. I refuse to listen. Because deep down, I know. Some doors, when opened, never close again. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel.